As we wrap up our reading of The Outsiders, we're actually going to go back to the beginning because what we want to know is a little bit more about the characters and the character development in this story as we study it from a literary point of view. And there's one thing that I want you guys to start considering. Look at your character charts. If you do not have a character chart, this is the one that I'm talking about. You can still do all of the activities without this. We're looking at each of the names of the character, what type they are, whether they're protagonist, antagonist, or a supporting character, their descriptions, flat around, and static or dynamic. We filled this out right after we've finished chapter 1 and added some more after chapter 2. But if you look down your characteristics and descriptions column, or if you remember some of the descriptions that we had of the characters, what you'll find is that Ponyboy's description of characters and who they are is often quite wrong. And we're going to look at these three characters in particular, Derry, Dallas, and Johnny, and what he got wrong. If you look at what he told us directly with his direct characterization, we're told that Derry is mean. We're told that he will not understand. But if you look at the story as a whole, we find that Derry is kind of the opposite of mean. Derry shows him love. He hugs him in the hospital. And he faces a lot of the same conflicts that Pony does. And that means that he understands where Pony is coming from. And we see this as the story advances through to the end, where Pony got it wrong. And there are other ways and other things that he got wrong about Derry, but that's a good start. Notice how this is laid out, by the way, from a literary point of view. You explain where it started, you show some evidence of how he's wrong and what particularly shows that Pony was wrong, and that will provide all the explanation and evidence that you need. But Pony is not just wrong about Derry. In fact, if you look at all of his characters, he gets something wrong about almost every single one. Dallas is one of the characters that he gets wrong the most, because Dallas is described as uncaring, selfish, and unbreakable. He has this terrible background, and Pony says he just can't be broken. He'll face it all. But we know that that's not true. As the story comes to an end, we see that Dallas breaks. And we see that moment at the hospital. But the events that immediately follow, of course, show it even more so. And when it comes to being uncaring or selfish, Dallas is also the opposite of that. In some ways, he loves Johnny more than anyone else. And he's definitely not selfish in that he helped Ponyboy and Johnny when they were running away. He gave to them money, a gun, and even his jacket. And while that might not seem like such a big deal, not only is he showing that he's not selfish, he's giving them things. Look at what these things might represent. Money is a way of providing for somebody. You are giving them the things that you need. And that then, from Dallas, is a symbol that he's trying to provide for Pony and Johnny. Another thing he gives them is a gun, which, well, not the best gift for a couple of 14-year-olds, or Johnny was a little older at this point. Either way, it is still a symbol. And what a gun is a symbol of in this case is protection. The only protection that he knows, which maybe isn't the best sort of protection. And last but not least, Dallas gives him his jacket, something that he cares a lot about, has a lot of value attached to, and he hands it off. That jacket, then, symbolizes his love and care for them, his true feelings. And those three symbols together show that he is not selfish. And that leaves us with Johnny, though we could do more. Johnny is shown to be, at the beginning, weak. We also see he's almost childish. And both of these qualities end up being wrong. And so does the idea that he would never hurt anybody. This is how Pony sees him, and yet Johnny himself is not that way. Johnny immediately stands up to Dally. He's not someone who is weak. He has an inner strength. And that shows he's not childish, as does his saving the children in the fire. He's someone who is very strong, but also quite smart to be able to get them out of there. And we know that he will hurt people if he needs to. And we saw that with Bob. In some ways, Johnny is in fact the strongest of characters, because he did something that essentially gave his life for somebody else. And that's a strength that very few people have. And yet Ponyboy had seen him as weak. And that brings us to our second question. Because when an author makes a choice like this, to make our narrator be unreliable, they're making a point. So what point is Hinton making? In other words, why does she make this choice? Well, there's a lot of answers to this, and there are a lot of different ways that you can take this. First, one of the points that she's making is that Pony is flawed. This is a really good choice to make, because not only does that make for a more interesting character, it also makes it so that he has room to grow. And if you think about it, interesting hints towards the character being round. In other words, there are a lot of qualities to them. And room to grow hints that he might be dynamic. Both things that you want in a main character. So by making her narrator be wrong, she's showing us some of the flaws. Another thing that she's showing us is that perceptions are often false. The way we see people often is not how they really are. And this can be with both people we know really well and people that we don't know at all. Because we can see it with three people, Derry, Dallas, and Johnny, that Pony knew quite well, and he was wrong about them. But we also see it with characters like Bob, who he finds out more and more about as the story goes on, where Ponyboy's initial judgment of Bob was wrong. And this here is a message. This is something that she's trying to show us. And she does that using that unreliable narrator. And you can see by using a little literary technique, she's able to make a larger message. And whenever we're looking at a larger message, what we're talking about is a theme, a point the author is making. So right here, this is part of the development of theme, how our author chose her narrator. And theme is present in a lot of different areas in the story. I mean, you can see it in the very title itself. She's telling us that these are the outsiders. These are the people who do not fit. And yet as the story progresses, you find more and more people are outsiders, people who do not fit, whether it be the Socs who struggle despite being so much more well off compared to everyone around them, or Soda, who seems so carefree and yet struggles so much with the drama in his family and the loss of his girlfriend. All of those things show that people are struggling in different ways, and they are all, in a sense, the outsiders, which fits with the theme that perceptions are often false. And there are more ways to study that, but we're going to set that aside for just a moment. What I want you to look at now is the rest of your chart. We're going to talk about flat versus round characters and static versus dynamic. Now we know that flat or round characters are determined by how many characteristics they have. And you have to be able to explain how you know a character is flat or round. So we did this with Ponyboy already. And we noticed that Ponyboy is a round character, and we gave a lot of different reasons for this, some of which were positive characteristics. Remember, that does not include physical description. This is only characteristics, internal. And it also included negative characteristics. So we can see that Ponyboy is somewhat judgmental from the previous things. So Ponyboy is round because he can be judgmental, but he's also loyal and smart, even if he isn't street smart. So we have a lot of characteristics, and your evidence has actually already been found because your evidence you found in this previous column, so you don't have to reintroduce that evidence here. If you hadn't found it over here, you would have had to list specific instances that told you that he is judgmental, loyal, and smart. So we get to save a little bit of a step with that. Now, what about flat characters? So, for instance, one of the characters who's somewhat flat is Steve Randall. We know he's flat because all we really know is he is Soda's friend, which isn't a characteristic. He's somewhat mean. And he fights. Of those, only one is really even a full characteristic. So we don't know a ton about him. He doesn't come across as realistic as the other characters. And that's okay, because an author only has so many chances to really make a character well developed. So sometimes you're going to get flat characters just because the author doesn't have time to develop them. And if you think about Steve Randall's role in the story, it really isn't that big. He doesn't do a lot. What we're going to look at next is static and dynamic. In order to talk about characters being static or dynamic, you have to do a full explanation, and that will include both your explanation and your evidence. So let's look at Ponyboy. If Ponyboy is dynamic, it means that he changed in the story, and we know that Ponyboy is dynamic. But, of course, we have to support our answer. Ponyboy is dynamic because he used to be judgmental, but at the end of the story, he shows he knows people are alike. There are a lot of places where this is shown. We can see this with his talk with Cherry. But we can also see other changes. You could have said that he's dynamic because he dares to stand up for himself, which we see in that final scene when he breaks the pop bottle to defend himself against an attack, unlike the first scene in the story. You could say he's dynamic because he now understands that his family loves him, and you can show that in contrast to his thoughts about Derry at the start. At the end of the story, he asks if he called out to Derry because he wanted Derry to know that he loved him. There are a lot of different ways. You only need one. But what do you do if a character is static? Explain how the choices they made at the end are consistent with who they were at the start. For instance, Steve Randall still fights in the Rumble. He doesn't learn much about other people, and that's because he's static. Go ahead and fill out these categories for tomorrow.